The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of the community center on Maple Street, casting long shadows across rows of empty folding chairs. In the corner, a man stood alone, his hands trembling as he arranged handwritten notes on a card table. His name tag read, David, Facilitator, in black marker that had bled slightly into the cheap paper. David Chen was 67 years old. 3 months earlier, he'd had nothing. Not in the philosophical sense, in the most literal way possible. No savings, no home, no plan. Just a social security check that barely covered a room in a boarding house and the weight of 38 years spent in middle management at a company that had forgotten his name the day he left. But now, at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning, he stood in this borrowed space, waiting. The chairs remained empty. The coffee he'd made with his own money sat untouched in the corner, growing cold. Outside, he could hear traffic, life moving forward while he stood still. His throat tightened. The flyer he'd spent 2 weeks distributing throughout the neighborhood hung on the wall behind him. Free workshop, rebuilding your life after 60. 50 copies distributed, 0 responses. He checked his watch, 9:52. The workshop was supposed to start at 10. David's hand moved toward the notes, ready to gather them, ready to admit defeat, ready to accept what everyone had been telling him for months, that this idea was foolish, that no one cared, that he should just accept his circumstances and fade quietly into irrelevance. Then he heard it. The sound of footsteps. Hesitant. Uncertain. The door opened. What you're about to hear is the true story of a man who lost everything society tells us we need to matter: career, savings, status, security, and discovered something far more valuable on the other side of that loss. David Chen retired from his logistics coordinator position in 2019 with almost nothing to show for nearly 4 decades of work. A costly divorce, a failed business venture with his brother, medical bills from his late wife's illness, and a series of poor financial decisions had left him with a monthly Social Security check and not much else. No pension, no nest egg, no backup plan. Most people in his position would have every reason to feel defeated. Many do. But David made a decision that seemed, to everyone around him, completely irrational. Instead of focusing solely on survival, he chose to teach, to build something that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with meaning. Before we continue with this story, let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Never Too Late. Every week, we share real stories that remind you, age is just a number. This is not a fairy tale about sudden wealth or miraculous rescue. This is something more honest, and perhaps more powerful. This is about what happens when you stop waiting for life to give you permission to matter. David Chen had never been the kind of man who stood out in a crowd. Born in 1952 to immigrant parents who ran a small grocery store in Sacramento, he learned early that the path to security meant keeping your head down, working hard, and not asking for too much. His father, who had arrived from Guangdong province with $20 and a suitcase, used to say, "In America, if you work steady, you eat steady." It was a philosophy that shaped David's entire approach to life. Get a stable job, stay loyal to your employer, save when you can, don't take unnecessary risks. For 38 years, David did exactly that. He worked for Consolidated Western Logistics, a mid-sized freight company, starting as a shipping clerk in 1981 and eventually working his way up to logistics coordinator. It wasn't glamorous. He spent his days managing spreadsheets, coordinating truck routes, solving problems with delayed shipments, and attending meetings that could have been emails. His cubicle on the 3rd floor had a small window that faced the parking lot. On sunny days, he could see the mountains in the distance. He kept a photograph of his wife, Margaret, on his desk, the one from their wedding day in 1976, both of them impossibly young, standing in front of City Hall in matching nervous smiles. Margaret had been a teacher, the kind who remembered every student's name years after they'd left her classroom. She brought home papers to grade every evening, red pen moving across homework assignments while David watched the evening news. They had a good life, not exciting, perhaps, but comfortable, predictable. safe. They'd planned for retirement together, small dreams, a camper van to visit national parks, maybe a little garden, time to finally read all those books stacked on the nightstand. But cancer doesn't care about plans. Margaret died in 2014, 2 weeks before David's 62nd birthday, after 18 months of treatments that drained their savings and left David sleeping in a chair beside her hospital bed. The medical bills came in thick envelopes for months afterward. Insurance covered some of it, but the co-pays, the experimental treatment they'd tried in desperation, the home care nurse, it all added up. David paid what he could, watching his retirement account dwindle with each withdrawal. Then came the call from his younger brother, James, in 2016. A sure thing, investment opportunity. A friend of a friend who needed partners for a coffee shop franchise. James was persuasive, always had been. This is our chance, David. Mom and Dad never got to enjoy their success. Let's build something together. David hesitated. It went against every instinct his father had instilled in him. But he was 64 years old, alone, still grieving, and the idea of building something with his brother, something that would outlast them, felt like a lifeline. He invested what remained of his savings, $43,000, everything he had left. The coffee shop never opened. The friend of a friend disappeared. James apologized profusely, promised to pay him back, then stopped returning calls. The lawsuit went nowhere. The money was gone. David returned to his cubicle, his window view, his spreadsheets. He stopped eating lunch in the break room, where younger colleagues talked about their investment portfolios and vacation homes. He kept his head down and counted the months until retirement. On a Friday afternoon in March 2019, David received an email from Human Resources. The company was restructuring. His position was being eliminated. He could retire early with a minimal severance package or accept reassignment to a lower position at reduced pay. He was 66 years old. He chose retirement. The goodbye party was held in the same break room where he'd eaten lunch for decades. There was a sheet cake from the grocery store and a card signed by people who had worked beside him for years but barely knew him. His supervisor gave a brief speech about David's dedication and steady presence. Someone took a photo. Everyone clapped politely. David carried his personal belongings to his car in a banker's box. The photograph of Margaret, a coffee mug his daughter had given him for Father's Day 15 years ago, a few papers, 38 years reduced to a box that fit in his passenger seat. His daughter, Sarah, lived in Boston with her own family. They talked once a month, brief calls that felt more like obligation than connection. She'd offered to help financially after Margaret died, but David had refused, too proud to admit how bad things had gotten. "I'm fine, honey. Don't worry about your old dad." The apartment David had rented for 20 years suddenly felt too expensive on Social Security alone. He found a room in a boarding house on the east side of town, the kind of place where people didn't ask questions and doors locked from the inside. His room was 12 by 14 feet, a single bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, a hot plate he wasn't technically allowed to have, and a bathroom shared with 3 other tenants. He was 67 years old and he had nothing. Not in the dramatic sense of homelessness. He had shelter, food, basic necessities, but he had no savings, no prospects, no purpose. His days stretched out in front of him like an empty highway. He woke up, made instant coffee on the contraband hot plate, walked to the public library to spend time where air conditioning was free, walked back, ate dinner from a can, went to sleep. The other residents in the boarding house were younger, people between jobs, recovering from addictions, escaping bad situations. David was the oldest by 2 decades. He felt out of place, like he'd taken a wrong turn somewhere and ended up in someone else's life. At night, he lay in bed listening to the sounds of the house, arguments through thin walls, footsteps on creaking stairs, hum of the refrigerator in the shared kitchen. He thought about his father's grocery store, about Margaret grading papers, about the coffee shop that never opened, about the cubicle window and the mountains he used to see in the distance. He thought about the question that haunted him most. What had it all been for? 38 years of steady work, a lifetime of doing what was expected. And here he was, alone in a rented room, with nothing to show for any of it except the growing certainty that he'd somehow missed the point of his own life. On his 67th birthday, Sarah called. "Happy birthday, Dad. How are you doing?" "Fine," he said, the lie automatic. "Just fine." After they hung up, David sat on the edge of his bed and allowed himself a moment of complete honesty. He wasn't fine. He was invisible, irrelevant. A man whose entire existence could be summarized in a paragraph at the back of a community obituary that no one would read. That night, David did something he rarely allowed himself to do. He opened the drawer in his dresser where he kept a few of Margaret's belongings: a silk scarf, a book of poetry, some photographs. At the bottom, he found an old journal she'd kept during her last year, when she was too weak to teach but still needed to feel useful. He opened it randomly. The entry was dated October 2013. "Today, a former student found me on Facebook. She's a doctor now." She wrote, "Mrs. Chen, you're the reason I didn't quit. You're the reason I believed I mattered." I cried reading that. All those years of lesson plans and parent conferences and grading papers until midnight, and one girl, one small moment of encouragement, changed everything for her. Teaching isn't about the curriculum. It's about showing up and reminding someone that they matter. That's the only thing that ever really matters. David closed the journal carefully. His hands were shaking. Margaret had known something he was only beginning to understand. The measure of a life wasn't in bank accounts or job titles, or even in how many years you'd worked. It was in whether you'd helped someone else believe they mattered. He put the journal back in the drawer and sat in the dark of his small room, listening to the sounds of other people's lives around him. And for the first time in months, David Chen began to feel something other than defeat. He felt angry. The anger wasn't the loud, destructive kind. It was quiet, focused. The kind of anger that clarifies instead of clouds. David was angry at a world that told him he was finished. Angry at a culture that measured worth by productivity and discarded people the moment their economic value declined. Angry at himself for believing it, for shrinking, for accepting that his story was over simply because someone decided his position was no longer necessary. But anger alone changes nothing. David knew that. What mattered was what you built with it. The idea came to him gradually, over several sleepless nights in late June 2019. He couldn't help everyone. He had no money, no platform, no credentials beyond a lifetime of showing up to a job that hadn't valued him. But he had something else. He had experience. Not the kind that came with certificates or accolades, but the kind that came from living, from failing, from starting over in a small rented room at 67 years old. And if he was struggling with this transition into forced irrelevance, how many others were too? David started spending more time at the public library, not just to escape the boarding house, but to observe. The library was full of older people during the day, men and women in their 60s and 70s, sitting alone at tables, reading newspapers, passing time. Some looked content, but many wore the same expression David saw in his mirror every morning: lost. One afternoon, he struck up a conversation with a woman named Dorothy in the magazine section. She was 72, a retired bookkeeper. Her husband had died 3 years earlier. Her kids lived across the country. She came to the library every day because, as she put it, "I need somewhere to be where I don't feel like I'm just waiting to die." The honesty of that statement hit David hard. He started talking to more people. Carl, a 70-year-old former construction foreman who didn't know what to do with himself now that his body couldn't handle physical labor. Patricia, 65, who'd taken early retirement from teaching and now felt like she'd lost her identity. Thomas, 68, whose small business had failed, leaving him with debt and shame. Each conversation revealed the same underlying pain. These were capable, experienced, wise people who felt invisible, who had skills and knowledge but no outlet, who wanted to contribute but didn't know how, who felt their best years were behind them because society kept insisting it was true. David went back to his room that evening and pulled out a notebook, the kind with the marbled black and white cover that he used to use for work. He began to write, not a business plan. He had no money for a business, not even a clear structure, just questions. What if there was a place where people over 60 could come together? Not to complain, not to be pitied, but to learn, to share, to rebuild. What if retirement wasn't an ending, but a beginning? What if we stopped seeing ourselves as society's leftovers and started seeing ourselves as pioneers? The word felt right. Pioneers. People who ventured into unknown territory and built something new. He wrote through the night, filling pages with ideas that felt both impossible and necessary. Workshops on practical skills, updating resumes for part-time work, navigating technology, managing limited finances, but also sessions on deeper things, rediscovering purpose, building community, confronting the fear of irrelevance. By 4 a.m., David had a rough outline. By dawn, he had a mission statement that made his chest tighten with something that felt dangerously close to hope. The Second Chapter Project, a free community resource for people over 60 who refuse to believe their story is over. The rational part of his mind immediately began listing obstacles. He had no money, no space, no credentials, no marketing budget, no email list, no website, no followers, nothing. Except he did have something. He had 67 years of life experience. He had the scars from failure. He had the perspective that comes from losing everything society tells you defines success and discovering you're still here, still breathing, still capable of wanting something more. And he had the memory of Margaret's journal entry. It's about showing up and reminding someone that they matter. David spent the next 3 weeks planning in obsessive detail. He used the computers at the library to research how to organize community workshops. He watched YouTube videos on public speaking. He designed a simple flyer using free design software, working slowly on the library computer with arthritic fingers that kept hitting wrong keys. The flyer was nothing fancy, just text and clip art. The Second Chapter Project, a free workshop for people over 60. Retired doesn't mean finished. Join us to explore what comes next. Tuesday mornings, 10 a.m. Maple Street Community Center. He used $60 from his Social Security check to print 50 copies at the copy shop. Then he walked through his neighborhood, taping them to telephone poles, leaving them at the grocery store bulletin board, at the laundromat, at the senior center. He approached the Maple Street Community Center, a small municipal building that hosted AA meetings and kids' art classes. The manager, a tired-looking woman in her 40s named Rita, listened to his pitch with undisguised skepticism. "So you want to use the space for free," she said. "Yes." "To run workshops for seniors?" "Yes." "And you're qualified how?" David met her eyes. "I'm qualified because I'm living it, because I'm 67 and broke and trying to figure out how to matter, and I think I'm not the only one." Something in Rita's expression shifted. Tuesday mornings. 2 hours. Don't make a mess. If nobody shows up after 4 weeks, we're done. Deal. David shook her hand, walked outside, and allowed himself 60 seconds of pure terror about what he'd just committed to. Then he went home and prepared. He bought a packet of index cards and a box of cheap pens with his food money. He prepared notes for 4 different workshop topics: updating your skills, building community after loss, finding purpose in transition, and you're not too old to start something new. He practiced speaking in front of the cracked mirror in his room, stumbling over words, feeling foolish, but pushing through. The night before the first workshop, David couldn't sleep. He lay in bed running through worst-case scenarios. No one would come. People would come, but walk out. He'd freeze up and forget everything he wanted to say. Someone would ask him why anyone should listen to a broke man living in a boarding house. At 3 a.m., he almost gave up. Almost decided to cancel the whole thing, take down the flyers, tell Rita he'd changed his mind. Then he thought about Dorothy at the library, saying she needed somewhere to be where she didn't feel like she was waiting to die. He thought about his father, who'd built a grocery store from nothing and never got to rest. He thought about Margaret, who'd changed a student's entire life trajectory with simple encouragement. And he thought about himself at 67, in a small room, with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Not to anyone else, to himself. That morning, David arrived at the community center at 8:30. He had 2 hours before the workshop. He used the small kitchen to brew coffee in a borrowed pot, using grounds he'd bought with his last $10. He arranged the folding chairs in a semicircle, not rows, because rows felt like school, and this needed to feel different. Welcoming. Equal. He set up his card table at the front, arranged his notes, and positioned the handmade sign he'd created. Welcome to the second chapter project. Then he waited. 9 sigh. The chairs stayed empty. 9:30, nothing. 9:45. David checked the flyers one last time. The date was correct. The time was clear. The location was accurate. 9:52. He heard footsteps outside. 9:53. The door opened. A woman stood in the doorway. She was perhaps 70, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing a cardigan despite the summer heat. She looked at David, at the chairs, at the coffee pot. "Is this the workshop?" she asked. Her voice carried equal parts hope and suspicion. David's throat was so dry he could barely speak. "Yes, it is. Please, come in." She hesitated, then stepped inside. Her name was Eleanor. She'd been a paralegal for 40 years before retiring. Her husband had Alzheimer's and was in a care facility she could barely afford to visit. Her children were busy with their own lives. She saw the flyer at the grocery store and decided, what the hell, it was just 2 hours. They talked while they waited for others who never came. Just the two of them and 30 empty chairs. At 10:15, David was ready to apologize and send her home. Then Eleanor said something that changed everything. "Are you going to give up after one person showed up? Or are you going to teach the workshop anyway?" David looked at her. At this one woman who'd had the courage to walk through the door. "I'm going to teach the workshop," he said. And he did. For the next 90 minutes, David facilitated a conversation about transition, purpose, and resilience. He didn't lecture. He asked questions. He listened. He shared his own story, the cubicle job, the lost savings, the room in the boarding house. The fear and the anger and the slow realization that worth isn't measured in bank accounts. Eleanor cried twice. So did David. At 11:45, Eleanor stood to leave. She paused at the door. "Next week," she said, "I'm bringing my neighbor. She needs this." The following Tuesday, 3 people came: Eleanor, her neighbor Judith, and a man named Frank who'd seen the flyer at the laundromat. The Tuesday after that, 7 people, then 12. Then, by the 5th week, 23 people filled the semicircle of chairs, drinking donated coffee and sharing stories about who they were, who they'd been, and who they might still become. David Chen was 67 years old. He had no money, no credentials, no business plan, but he had shown up, and showing up, it turned out, was everything. The first few months of the second chapter project were held together by stubborn will and borrowed supplies. David continued living in his boarding house room, continued surviving on Social Security, continued walking to the library between workshop sessions. But something fundamental had shifted in him. He no longer felt invisible. The workshops evolved organically. Each Tuesday morning became a space for honest conversation about the things people over 60 were afraid to admit. The fear of irrelevance, the shame of financial struggle, the loneliness of outliving friends, the confusion of feeling young inside a body that society deemed obsolete. But more than that, it became a place where people helped each other with practical skills. Frank, the man from the laundromat, had been a computer technician. He started teaching basic tech skills to participants struggling with smartphones and email. Judith, Eleanor's neighbor, was a former nurse who led a session on navigating Medicare paperwork. Carl, the construction foreman from the library, taught a workshop on home repairs and odd jobs seniors could do for supplemental income. The second chapter project wasn't about David being an expert. It was about creating a space where everyone's expertise mattered. By December 2019, weekly attendance had grown to 35 people. Rita, the community center manager, stopped by one morning and stood in the back watching. Afterward, she approached David. I thought this was going to be another failed feel-good project, she admitted. But these people keep coming back. They're different when they leave than when they arrive. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. She offered him Tuesday and Thursday mornings, free of charge. In January 2020, Dorothy from the library brought her adult daughter to a workshop. The daughter was a reporter for the local newspaper. She asked to write a story about the Second Chapter project. David hesitated. He wasn't doing this for recognition, but Dorothy convinced him. "Let people know this exists," she said. "There are hundreds of people like us who don't even know they're allowed to start again." The article ran in February. It was a small piece, buried on page 7 of the local section, but it included the community center address and the workshop schedule. The next Tuesday, 53 people showed up. David stood in front of the room, looking at faces he'd never seen before. Men and women in their 60s, 70s, even a few in their 80s, all of them carrying the same question in their eyes. Is it really true? Can we still matter? He took a breath and began the session the way he always did. "Tell me your name and one thing you've given up on that you wish you hadn't." That morning, he heard stories that broke his heart and rebuilt it simultaneously. A woman who'd stopped painting after her husband told her it was a waste of time. A man who'd dreamed of writing a book but convinced himself it was too late. A widow who'd stopped cooking because eating alone felt pointless. A retired teacher who'd stopped reading because no one asked for her recommendations anymore. "Here's what I've learned," David said when they'd finished sharing. "Giving up is easy. Starting again is terrifying. But here's the secret nobody tells you. Terrifying is better than invisible. Terrifying means you still care. And as long as you still care, you're not finished." The room was silent. Then someone started clapping. Then everyone was clapping. And David realized, with a jolt that felt like electricity through his chest, that he wasn't just helping others find purpose. He'd found his own. By March 2020, the Second Chapter project had grown beyond what David could manage alone. Participants began volunteering to facilitate specific sessions. Eleanor organized a writing circle. Frank expanded tech training to 2 sessions per week. A man named Robert, a retired accountant, started offering free tax preparation help for low-income seniors. The workshops became a network. People exchanged phone numbers. They met for coffee outside of sessions. They helped each other find part-time work, navigate social services, fix leaking faucets, understand medication instructions. They stopped seeing themselves as burdens and started seeing themselves as resources. Then COVID-19 arrived, and everything shut down. The community center closed in mid-March. David's Tuesday morning sanctuary disappeared overnight. He tried to stay connected with participants through phone calls, but it wasn't the same. Many didn't have computers for video meetings. Some were isolated, scared, increasingly depressed. David felt the old familiar weight settling back over him. The fear that it had all been temporary, that the Second Chapter project was just a brief flash before inevitable darkness. He was walking through his neighborhood in April, past the closed library and shuttered businesses, when he saw Frank sitting on his porch. Frank waved him over. "I've been thinking," Frank said, "about the project, about everyone scattered and lonely again." "Me too," David admitted. "What if we went online? I know most people don't have computers, but what if we helped them get set up? Used computers are cheap. I could teach people one-on-one, safely, distanced, get everyone on Zoom, keep the community alive." David wanted to say it was impossible, that people their age couldn't adapt that quickly, that he barely understood Zoom himself. Instead, he said, "Let's try." The next 2 months were an education in creative persistence. Frank collected donated laptops. David and other volunteers delivered them to participants' homes, teaching basic technology skills through screen doors and windows. They printed step-by-step instructions in large font. They set up phone support lines. They failed repeatedly and tried again. By June 2020, the Second Chapter project was meeting virtually. Attendance was lower. Only about 20 people managed the technology transition. But the core community remained. Something unexpected happened during those Zoom sessions. the forced intimacy of seeing into each other's homes, the shared vulnerability of fumbling with technology, the collective experience of navigating fear during a pandemic. It deepened the connections. People stopped performing and started being real. David facilitated sessions from his boarding house room. His tiny space was visible to everyone now. The cracked mirror, the single bed, the hot plate on the dresser. He'd worried people would judge him. Instead, several participants privately messaged him to say seeing his circumstances gave them permission to be honest about their own. "You're not pretending to have all the answers," Patricia, the former teacher, told him during a one-on-one call. "You're just showing us it's possible to keep going anyway." That's more powerful than any motivational speech. As the pandemic continued through 2020 and into 2021, the Second Chapter Project adapted. They added different types of sessions: virtual game nights, online book clubs, grief support groups, creative writing workshops, exercise classes led by participants with yoga or Tai Chi experience. More significantly, they started documenting stories. Eleanor suggested it during a September 2020 Zoom call. "We should record these stories people share here. Not for us. For anyone else who thinks they're too old to start over." David was hesitant. His instinct was to keep things small, private, protected. But he was learning to trust the community's wisdom. They started a simple blog, no fancy design, just written stories from participants about their experiences with retirement, loss, starting over, finding purpose. David interviewed people and wrote up their stories. Frank handled the technical setup. The blog got 17 readers in the first month, 29 in the second month. By December 2020, it was getting hundreds of visits per week. People started emailing David, strangers from other states, other countries, saying they'd found the blog and felt seen for the first time in years, asking if they could join the Zoom sessions, wanting to know how to start similar groups in their communities. David was overwhelmed. This had started as a small workshop in a community center. Now it was growing into something he'd never imagined. In January 2021, a woman named Patricia Michaels reached out. She ran a nonprofit focused on aging issues and had discovered the Second Chapter Project blog. She asked to meet with David virtually. "What you're doing matters," she told him. "I've worked in this field for 20 years, and most programs for seniors are either condescending or focused solely on entertainment. You're treating people like they still have value to contribute, like they're not finished. That's rare." She offered something David never expected: a small grant, $5,000 to expand the Second Chapter Project, to formalize the structure, to reach more people. David stared at his laptop screen, speechless. "I can't accept this," he finally said. "I'm not a nonprofit. I don't have an organization. I'm just a guy running workshops from a boarding house." Patricia smiled. "That's exactly why you should accept it. Because you're doing this for the right reasons. Let me help you set up the paperwork. Let's turn this into something sustainable." Over the next 6 months, with Patricia's guidance, the Second Chapter Project became an official nonprofit. David remained the director, a role he found both terrifying and energizing. They used the grant money to secure liability insurance, create a proper website, and purchase better technology for virtual sessions. By fall 2021, as the world slowly reopened, the Second Chapter Project had 127 active participants across 3 states. The original Tuesday morning workshops resumed in person, but they also maintained virtual options for people who preferred them or lived too far away. Local news stations started calling. David did interviews, always emphasizing that this wasn't about him. It was about the participants, the community, the simple idea that retirement is not an ending. In December 2021, a regional newspaper did a feature story. The headline read, "Retiree with Nothing Built, Something That Changed Everything." David's daughter Sarah called after reading it. She was crying. "Dad, I had no idea. All this time, I thought you were struggling. I mean, I knew financially you were, but I thought you were just getting by. I didn't know you were building this." "I was getting by," David said. "This is what helped me survive getting by. Can I come visit? I want to see it, meet these people." Sarah flew out in January 2022. She attended a workshop, met Eleanor and Frank and Dorothy and dozens of others. Afterward, she and David had dinner at a small diner near the boarding house. "I'm sorry I wasn't there more," Sarah said. "After Mom died, after everything that happened, I just know how to help." "You're here now," David said. "That's what matters." By spring 2022, the Second Chapter Project had received enough donations to hire a part-time coordinator to handle administrative tasks. David still facilitated workshops, but he no longer had to manage everything alone. More importantly, participants were starting their own projects. Inspired by David's example, several had launched initiatives: a tool-sharing library for seniors, a home-cooked meal exchange network, a mentorship program connecting retirees with young people navigating career changes. The ripple effect was exactly what David had hoped for. Not people being rescued, but people remembering they could rescue themselves and each other. In August 2022, David moved out of the boarding house. Not into anything fancy, just a small one-bedroom apartment with a kitchen table where he could write and plan. Participants from the Second Chapter Project helped him move, bringing his few belongings in someone's borrowed truck. Standing in his new apartment that first evening, David thought about the journey from that cubicle window to this moment. 3.5 years since retirement. 3 years since that first workshop with Eleanor and 30 empty chairs. He wasn't rich. His Social Security still barely covered expenses, though the small salary from the nonprofit helped. But he'd discovered something more valuable than financial security. He'd discovered he still had something to give, and that giving it had saved his life. The question he'd asked himself in the boarding house, what had it all been for, finally had an answer. It had been for this. All of it. The steady job, the failures, the losses, the room with the cracked mirror. It had all led to this moment, where his pain had become purpose, and his story had given others permission to write new chapters in their own lives. David Chen was 70 years old, and his life had never mattered more. Today, the Second Chapter Project serves over 300 people across 7 states. David still facilitates the original Tuesday morning workshop at the Maple Street Community Center, though now there are 23 other facilitators running sessions throughout the week. The program has expanded to include job training, creative arts, financial literacy, health and wellness, and something David calls legacy projects, helping participants identify and pursue one meaningful goal before they die. Not bucket list items, meaningful contributions. Eleanor published a memoir about losing and rediscovering herself after her husband's Alzheimer's diagnosis. Frank started a nonprofit refurbishing computers for seniors. Dorothy volunteers at the library teaching literacy classes. Carl leads a handyman service where retired tradespeople do affordable home repairs for other seniors. David still lives simply, still walks more than he drives, still makes coffee on a hot plate, though now in his own kitchen. He could probably afford more. The nonprofit pays him a modest salary, and speaking requests occasionally come with honoraria. But comfort was never the point. The point was this: proving that relevance isn't granted by institutions or measured by income. It's claimed by anyone brave enough to show up and insist their story isn't finished. In late 2023, David received an invitation to speak at a national conference on aging. Standing on that stage, looking out at hundreds of faces, he thought about the man he'd been 4 years earlier, defeated, invisible, convinced his life had narrowed to a point of irrelevance. He thought about Margaret's journal entry, about his father's grocery store, about that first morning with Eleanor and 30 empty chairs. "I retired with nothing," he told the audience, "and I thought that nothing defined me. But here's what I learned. When you have nothing left to lose, you have everything to give. The question isn't whether you still matter. The question is whether you're brave enough to prove it, not to anyone else, but to yourself." The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. But what mattered more were the emails that came afterward, dozens of them, hundreds eventually, from people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, saying, "I thought it was too late. You showed me it's not." David answers every single one, because that's what the Second Chapter Project is really about. Not programs or workshops or statistics. It's about one person telling another person, I see you. You matter. Your story isn't over. It's about the revolutionary act of refusing to disappear. On quiet mornings, David still walks through his old neighborhood, past the boarding house where he once lived. Sometimes he stops and looks up at the window of his former room. He doesn't feel shame about that time anymore. He feels gratitude, because that room, that rock bottom, that moment of having absolutely nothing, it freed him from the illusion that worth comes from external validation, freed him to discover what he'd always had but never recognized, the power to choose meaning over comfort, contribution over security, connection over isolation. The truth is, David Chen didn't build the Second Chapter project despite having nothing. He built it because he had nothing left to prove and everything left to give, and that made all the difference. There's a quote David keeps on an index card taped to his bathroom mirror now. It's from Margaret's journal, written just weeks before she died. The life that matters isn't the one that looks impressive from the outside. It's the one that changes something on the inside, yours or someone else's. That's the only currency that means anything in the end. David reads it every morning. Then he makes his coffee, gathers his notes, and heads to the community center. Because there are people waiting. People who need to hear that it's not too late, that they're not finished, that their next chapter might be the one that matters most. And David Chen, 71 years old now, with still relatively little in his bank account, but everything that matters in his heart, shows up to tell them, every single Tuesday, without fail. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments. What would you change if you had a second chance? Maybe you've been feeling invisible lately. Maybe retirement felt more like an ending than a beginning. Maybe you've convinced yourself that your most meaningful years are behind you. David Chen's story is proof that none of that is true. You don't need money to matter. You don't need credentials to contribute. You don't need permission to start again. You just need the courage to show up, to refuse invisibility, to insist that your story isn't over just because someone decided your economic productivity has declined. The second chapter of your life isn't about recovering what you lost. It's about discovering what you've always had but never fully used. Your wisdom, your experience, your capacity to help others feel less alone. Don't forget to subscribe to Never Too Late for more stories that remind us. The next chapter of your life can be the most powerful one yet. Because David was right about one thing. It's never too late to matter. It's only too late when you stop trying.